Welcome to Module 13. This week we are discussing the Oceania region. Here we have the word cloud that was generated from your responses from the first week of the course. You can see that kangaroo and also kangaroos features prominently. Also the very populous city of Sydney, which is not the capital of Australia but is a state capital. Also different physical geography features such as the outback, mountains, islands, the ocean. Those also were often cited, as well as Lord of the Rings, which on this map got cut up into Lord and also Rings, but I'm guessing that's what you all meant. So to begin, I wanted to speak about the physical geography of the Oceania region. First, when we talk about Oceania, we are referring to Australia, New Zealand, the South Pacific, which includes many small islands, and also Antarctica. So for this module, I will be discussing mainly Australia, New Zealand, and the South Pacific. If you're interested in learning more about Antarctica, then I recommend that you read the book, and then also I could point you to more resources if you're interested. So, as you may have already guessed, Oceania is oriented, as a region, is oriented mainly towards the Pacific Ocean. Also the Indian Ocean, which is located to the west and also southwest of the region. It is rather isolated geographically speaking, not only from South and Southeast Asia, but also, of course, from Latin America and North America, which to the east and to the northeast. It has a low population, approximately 37 million people or so in 2011, and it's made up of three major island regions. The first being Melanesia, which includes islands such as Papua New Guinea, and that is located, here we have Papua New Guinea, and Melanesia is located more or less in this area of the South Pacific. To the north of that is Micronesia, which includes the Federated States of Micronesia, and then also the Marshall Islands, which perhaps you've heard of, as well as a small island called Kiribati, which we will be watching a video about later on. And third, you have the Polynesia subregion, and this is located to the east of Melanesia and also Micronesia. This includes islands such as American Samoa and also the Cook Islands, as well as a lot of times it includes the Hawaiian Islands, which are a part of the U.S., of course. So I wanted to talk about some of the landform features of this region. In Australia, there is little orogenic activity, which means that there is little activity due to the movement of tectonic plates. Australia itself sits, because of where it sits in relation to the tectonic plates, there is not movement, so there forms what is sometimes referred to as a continental shield. There are three major regions in Australia. On the far eastern side, and you can see it here in the map in the bottom right hand corner, is the Great Dividing Range. Just to the west of that, on the interior, you have what are known as the interior lowlands, and then much of the western and also west central part of Australia is itself the Western Plateau, which is a very hot and dry place, and as a result is characterized by a couple of major deserts. Speaking more about the landforms of Australia, I wanted to discuss the Outback. So many of you may be familiar with the Outback restaurant, and then also the Outback showed up on the word cloud for this week, so it is something that we often associate with Australia. The Outback itself is a remote, dry, and also inland region. There's a lot of cattle farming in the Outback. You have also a lot of mining, and so mining centers, and you have roads and then also trains that or railroads that lead to the interior to carry out this mining activity. Because it is a very hot and dry region, there are also frequent droughts and then also wildfires. Something that we will discuss later on are some of the major ethnic groups in Australia, and some of the Outback is very sacred to the major ethnic group in Australia, which is called the Aboriginals or Aborigines people. Moving on to the landforms of the Pacific Islands. These islands are often, if they're high islands, then they are characterized by volcanic activity and typically have high rainfall due to their tropical location and also the prevalence of rainforests. If they are low islands, then they are what is called an atoll, and they typically have low rainfall. Overall, the climate of Australia, it is very different, just as it is here in the United States. In the interior, it's very dry. On the east coast, where the Great Dividing Range is, it is rather wet. And then in the southwest area, which areas such as the major city of Perth, has more of what we would consider to be a Mediterranean climate. New Zealand, which is located just to the east of Australia, on the North Island it's much warmer, but on the east coast it is drier. And for more or less the Pacific Islands have a very tropical climate. Next I want to talk about some of the ecosystems in this region of the world. So the Pacific Islands and also Australia have really helped to shape a subfield of geography called biogeography. And biogeography is the study of the spatial arrangement of flora and fauna, or plant and animal species. And this evolved from the overlap between geography and biology, as the name implies. One theory in particular that is very important and applies well to this region is the theory of island biogeography. So this theory states very simply that diversity of flora and also fauna species increases with the increase in island size. So the larger the island, the greater diversity that there will be of flora and fauna species. Here we have a map. This was taken from another geography textbook. Importantly, this shows Wallace's line. That is the line in the red. And what this does is it says Wallace was a British naturalist in the mid-1800s, and he found that flora and fauna species on either side of this line have very little interaction. So those flora and fauna species that are in Southeast Asia typically stay there, and there is little overlap between those species that are found in the Oceania region. And even though there are, very small bodies of water, only a couple of kilometers separate islands sometimes, Wallace found, and this theory still holds largely today, that there is little interaction between islands, and for whatever reason it exists. So next I want to talk about some of the environmental history of the region. So as we discussed earlier, the region as a whole is rather isolated. In Australia there is great diversity, in particular over 20,000 different plants, 650 species of birds, and more than 380 different types of reptiles. The Great Barrier Reef is perhaps something that you've heard of. It is classified as a World Heritage Site, so it receives extra protection from the United Nations and from other governing bodies, and as well as the local governments. It's more than 1,200 miles long and is made up of more than 3,000 individual reefs. It's particularly important because of the number of species of coral that is there, and also the fish. And importantly, the Great Barrier Reef brings in more than $1 billion yearly in tourism. So this, as we'll see later, is a huge help to the region, many of which, the countries of which are economically underdeveloped. Next, I talk about ecosystems of the Pacific Islands. So the plant species are dispersed by birds or sometimes by the ocean. For instance, if plants fall into the ocean and then the tide washes them ashore, sometimes they are able to root and then spread throughout the Pacific Islands that way. The Pacific Islands, higher islands have rainforests, and so they have higher rainfall. There are mangroves in coastal region. Mangroves is when plants grow in saline waters or salty waters. Some of the larger islands in the Pacific Islands have middle elevation grasslands. The low islands are typically characterized by having coral, They are dry and they also have little vegetation. Next, I want to talk about some of the human geography aspects of this region. So to begin, some of the early inhabitants colonized or came to the region about 40,000 years ago. There was migration from Southeast Asia to Australia, New Guinea, and also nearby Pacific Islands. About 3,500 years ago, there was dispersal to more distant islands in the region. Next, I want to talk about some of the indigenous groups in the region. So in Australia, you have the Aborigine people. They are characterized by having a variety of languages and also cultural beliefs. Typically, the Aborigine people are hunter-gatherers. Something that might be of interest to you, especially if you're interested in cultural and social geography, is the idea of dream time, which speaks to beliefs about creation. Dreaming in Aborigines culture refers to the idea about spirituality. Songlines were used as they serve as maps, and so what it is they are literally songs that have terrain descriptions and also other important resources for navigating the region. In New Zealand, you have the Maori people. They came from the Polynesian Islands approximately 800 to 1,000 years ago. It is a warrior culture and is largely oriented toward the sea, and so one thing that is well known about them is that they have advanced canoes. European exploration in the region began in the mid-1700s, who first began with the Spanish and Portuguese and then followed by the Dutch as well as British interests. In Australia, you have British settlements being formed in the early 1800s. In the beginning, convicts that came from Great Britain were used as forced labor. You had the importation of sheep, and then consequently you had the exportation of wool from the sheep. In the late 1800s, importantly, there was a gold rush. Also shortly thereafter began the mining of other metals and minerals. And so what you have here is consequently the construction of railroads and also roads from the exterior or the coastline to the interior of the country, which helped with the overall development of the country and especially bringing populations to the interior of the country. You can think of this, the mining of metals and minerals such as gold, as being a major pull factor, pulling people into the interior of the country. Early on, New Zealand was important in global trade because of the establishment of sealing stations. So skin, bones, and also oil from seals were sold globally and traded globally. In 1840, you have the Treaty of Waitangi between the Maori people and Great Britain. Today, a lot of people see this as the founding of New Zealand as a nation. To this day, however, it is still not exactly agreed upon what was signed in that treaty. Importantly, when we're thinking about the role of New Zealand in global trade today, refrigeration and the invention of refrigeration ships was very important because it allowed New Zealand's meat and dairy product industry to greatly increase, and so much of the meat and dairy from the region comes from New Zealand. Early on, the Pacific Islands were of very little interest to Europeans, and so from the late 1700s and early 1900s, you have some traders in the region, but not like you had in Australia or New Zealand. Overall, these islands were taken by British, French, and also Germans. Importantly, we have in this region the introduction of exotics. And so this is a term that gets us to learn about ecological imperialism in the region. Exotics simply means that something that comes from elsewhere. And so you have, in the region, you have a lot of escaped domestic animals that came with early explorers and then also colonizers. You have horses, cattle, sheep, goats, pigs, and camels, among many other animals that are not native to the region, but quickly changed the ecosystem in the region. In 1859, the European rabbit was introduced. This spread quickly throughout the pasture land of Australia, and so what resulted was increase in use of hunting, and then also diseases were introduced to kill off the rabbit population. Also, rabbit-proof fences were put in place by farmers so that their crops were not hurt. In the early 1900s, Australia and New Zealand gained its independence from Great Britain. In 1901, the Commonwealth of Australia was founded. It currently includes 6 states and 2 territories. It also obtained from Britain Papua New Guinea. In New Zealand, it became a self-governing colony in 1907. It obtained protectorates of Pacific Islands, including the Cook Islands, Samoa, and Tokelau. Both countries maintained close relationships with Great Britain, and they fought with the Allies in World War II. An important turning point in the region was World War II, and this is when this region began close ties with the U.S. It did suffer some damage from bombing and occupation. Strategic naval bases were built in this region, strategic in the sense that Great Britain and the U.S. used them to carry out missions against the Axis powers. In the region, you did have a lot of testing of bombs, so you may have heard about the U.S. testing bombs in the Marshall Islands. Great Britain also tested bombs in Western Australia. France began in the 1960s and tested in French Polynesia. And this was a result of the local geography of the region. So these areas are rather isolated and then also have relatively low populations. So Western powers believed it safe, or safe enough at least, to carry out the testing of bombs. However, this has had lasting environmental impacts on the region, and fortunately this testing did cease about 50 years ago. Depending on how you look at it, you could view some of the military interactions in the region as a positive. So in Bikini Atoll, about 23 U.S. atomic bomb tests were carried out around the middle of the century. Today, however, it is a tourist destination for scuba divers. Scuba divers flock to the region to complete what is called wreck diving, and so what they do is they dive around sunken military ships. It is a activity that is sponsored by the government, and so the government is able to earn some money off of this legacy of imperialism and military in the region. Just briefly, there has been a lot of economic change in this region. So beginning in the 1970s, you have increased foreign investment, particularly Japanese investment in the region. You have restrictions by the United Nations and by Western Europe. So you have the realignment of local economies towards Asian markets. This is in Australia and New Zealand, and also in some of the Pacific Islands. You also have a rise in the service sector, so perhaps away from more traditional aspects of the economy like agriculture, in favor of finance, tourism especially, and also business services. The economies of the Pacific Islands is largely made up of money earned from migration, remittances, aid, and also bureaucracy. Hence the acronym MIRAB, or MIRAB economies. Fiji, for instance, relies mainly on tourism and also sugar production. Samoa also relies on tourism and coconut production, and Tuvalu relies on global communications. Together, these countries are characterized as having a large trade deficit. This deficit is in the billions of dollars, which can mean as much as $1,000 per person overall for the entire region. Here I've listed some of the most recent GDP per capita for countries in the region. Australia and New Zealand, you can see, have a rather large GDP per capita. Australia, however, is almost twice as high as New Zealand's GDP per capita. If you look, however, below those at the Pacific Islands GDP per capita, you can see that a lot of these are much, much lower, the lowest being the Solomon Islands at around $1,500 per person in 2011. So these data just give an indication of how underdeveloped, economically speaking, some of the countries in the South Pacific region are. Just want to briefly talk about population, and I can't underscore enough that this is a very sparsely populated region of the world. It is the least populated world region as well. It overall, among all the countries in the region, it had a population of approximately 37 million people in 2011. Much of this is made up of Australia's population, which is around 23 million people. Papua New Guinea, however, also has a very large population despite its smaller size. And you can see in this map on the right-hand side the population density for the region. Of course, much of the coastal region of Australia, the eastern coastal region, is more densely populated, whereas the interior and then also the rest of the coastline of the country is rather sparsely populated. Overall, some of the smaller islands have, you can't see it as well here on the map, but they have a higher population density. However, this region has overall has low birth rates, so that means that the population of the region is not climbing too significantly, and also has an aging population, as we have seen throughout the rest of the world. There is great poverty and inequality, as I discussed 2 slides ago. Australia and New Zealand, of course, overall have high GDPs. The highest poverty is amongst Aboriginal peoples and groups, and overall, sometimes the Aboriginal peoples are 4 times as likely to be in poverty as compared to non-Aboriginal groups in Australia and New Zealand. And as I said before too, the Pacific Islands have lower GDPs. A lot of livelihoods are subsistence in nature, meaning that people are literally just scraping by on a daily basis and only able to provide what they can for that day or for the very short term. The region has been heavily influenced by migration. So in Australia is mostly made up of British settlers in addition to the Aboriginal people. In 1901 you have the White Australia policy, which ranked British and Northern Europeans being the highest socially and economically. However, this was abolished in 1973, and in more recent decades you have a wave of immigrants from the southeast region of Asia. New Zealand has a relatively similar story with regards to Australia and the overall historical preference for persons of Western European descent, and recently too it has an increased number of Southeast Asian immigrants. The Pacific Islands, as we have discussed already, overall have a high degree of indigenous peoples living there, and in recent years, especially with regards to climate change and the potential effects of climate change for these islands, as well as economic opportunities, you have a lot of Pacific Islanders moving to Australia and New Zealand. So going on, just to discuss a little bit more about some of the effects of climate change in the region, and this is something that you will watch a video on and then complete the virtual activity on for this week. So just in case you're not familiar already, a refugee is somebody who is persecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group or political opinion, and then is forced to flee his or her country because of this. And so in recent times and over the last decade or two, it has been put forth the idea of a climate refugee, somebody who is forced to flee his or her homeland due to the effects of global climate change. And that's something that you'll be learning more about in the video that is assigned for this week. And also related to that is this idea of statelessness. And this is something that the United Nations is highly concerned about, especially in islands located in the Pacific Islands, but also throughout the world, islands that are going to feel the effects of global climate change and may cease to exist in just a couple of decades. So that's all for this week. Go ahead and review the weekly schedule, complete all assignments, and have a great week.